We're at Underground Performance today, where Alex has kindly lent his dyno to us. We're going to run our own cars up here, WRX versus Yaris. Now, they're both standard. They're not exactly powerhouses, but they both make pretty much the same power, don't they, Geordie?
Yep, and they're in the same, basically, class of car. They're all-wheel drive,
both
turbo.
manual gearbox, very different.
Yep.
This runs a 2.4 litre with not much boost. That runs a 1.6 litre 3-cylinder with a fair bit of boost. We were interested to run them both up, same conditions.
We wanted to see how the power curves,
and also try and plot the boost and see how that overlays, and I think we'll get some interesting results. I haven't seen too many videos online showing these cars how they actually make power, rather than everyone just talks about peak power and peak boost. But that's not really where you drive the car a lot of the time.
I personally think, I know, because you had yours on the dyno last week and it made 167 or something. That car will not make 167. So already I know this is going to make more. We're just curious to see how they make the power.
We bring the pointer to a lot of videos and we always forget it. It always gets left in the camera car, but today I finally brought it. And we're going to run the WRX up on Underground Performance's dyno, solely to give it a comparison against Giordo's Toyota GR Yaris. They make very similar power, but Alex is going to give me a bit of a crash course in how to strap the car.
Hang on. Are you telling me you are actually going to get your hands dirty for the first time in 25 years?
Maybe. We've got these in Subaru blue. We always hear a lot of stuff, in the comment section, oh, that guy can't strap it right, it's strapped wrong. And this is by internet comments who I'm assuming have done hundreds of strapping cars on the dyno themselves.
They have to have done.
They have to have done, because they're good at tuning, they're good at strapping, and they're good at driving.
That's right.
But Alex, you've actually got some real world experience and you're going to run through how we're going to strap this car today.
Well, I've strapped a few, kind of cars that come in here, all-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, some rear-wheel drive.
Yeah.
Quite varied, but the principles still apply. So we've got 4 straps underneath the car here. The middle 2 will pull the car down. So as you see here, this one sits on what we call the traction block, and it's through some rollers so that it pulls it down vertically. And that's quite important to ensure that the car is pulled down onto the front roller. And then the outer 2 straps here are for making sure the car doesn't shoot forward too much. So from a safety perspective, super important, but also from an experimental point of view, how we actually dyno the cars, it's important to do it this way so we capture the data. Usually when you cross strap them, you do it from one side to the other under the car, but you've got an exhaust hanging down, so it'll melt through the strap in 2 seconds.
Oh, okay.
So I have to strap it closer to the side.
We want to try and measure, we'll show the actual boost plot, I guess, the manifold pressure, see how it makes boost. Driving it feels very linear, and looking at the boost gauge it does. Be nice to try and map it. So Alex is just going to tap into the manifold here. We'll put the factory sensor back in. I would have to think, even though this runs less boost than what the Yaris will, I think it'll be much more linear. So I've just plumbed into the manifold there, and here we've got the vacuum boost pressure there. I copped a bit of flack last time for wearing the seat belt on the dyno, and I'm going to do it again because for obvious reasons the car thinks it's moving and it just beeps and it gets worse and worse and worse the faster you go. This is a new world record for the full boost. If this was in Sydney, this would be number one world record for the full boost WRX with the grey bumper boat. We said in the last video, the car feels like a big NA engine, and that's sort of how it drives. The boost gauge sort of shows that. You've got to rev it right out to get any boost into it. Imagine if you had all that in early, plus another 10 PSI. 11.3 PSI peak boost. I haven't seen these peak levels. I haven't seen this sort of boost pressure since I owned my Cordia Turbo back in 1997. rev limiter is very soft, and I swear it is set at 6,100 RPM. As soon as you're over red line, you feel a soft limiter come in.
What we can see here, run to run, is only temperature change. So I think you did a number of runs in succession.
Well, let's back it up a bit, Alex. I ran the dyno, I'm a complete rookie, and Alex was saying, try and get some more air into the engine before you do the run, and you were just loading up the car a little bit.
Yeah, a few sharp half pulls,
Yeah.
just in speed mode where you can run all the way up to 100 k's an hour, just to kind of give it, you know, a bit of a breath of fresh air and drop the IATs a little bit. So it's a bit of a shock to the intake, but it's almost like a reverse spike on the IATs.
Do you think on the street that would be more indicative of this run here? Because it would probably get better airflow.
I would say so.
Yeah.
You know, it depends on the ambient conditions, but if you're driving around, you've got airflow across the whole vehicle. Having said that, based on your speed and drag, there can be more load as well.
Yeah, so by looking at that, it was doing consistent 170 kilowatts when I was in the car, and Alex has done one run, and it's made 178.7. Solely, yeah, probably air intake. But yeah, on the last run I did, I was watching the boost gauge in the car, and it was just on 0.55 kPa the whole run, like it indicated on that graph here, and then it just spikes at the end.
Yeah.
The old WRXs, like I had an older one, years ago, they would spike straight away to 15 PSI, and then by red line it might be, say, at 10 to 11, which is very common on a factory boost car. Most of the run, where you really drive the car, most of the time you're under 5,000 RPM, and you've got
8 PSI.
8 pounds of boost.
So it's probably more like 140, 150 kilowatt car for the majority of the rev range.
Yep.
We see this with the Focus RSs as well. So they have a curved stock, and right at the end of the rev range, the RS logo flashes, it overboosts and gives it a little like that, and then gives it another 10 kilowatts at the end of the rev range.
That's interesting. Well, let's get the Yaris on, because I think it's going to be very different. And I've heard you've got to do like 50 handbrakes, pump the gas, say hi to your mum out the window, and then it decides it's going to go into dyno mode, yeah? I have seen this. It reminds me of the Nintendo 8-bit days with the up, down, left, right, BA. Was it BA start, AB start? This car needs, you'll have to see it to believe it. This needs handbrakes. Is it foot pumps on the brake pedal?
I believe so. Ignition on, ignition off, clutch in, on the brake.
So to compare, stock for stock, Luke's WRX makes 202 kilowatts at 5,600 RPM. Its torque band is very broad, starts at 2, goes all the way to 5.6, 350 newton meters by the way. This, as a comparison, makes a whopping 2 kilowatts less, so it's 200 kilowatts at 6,500, so much higher in the rev range, remembering this is a much smaller engine. The torque band's pretty narrow. It's 370 newton meters, so it's pretty high, but it doesn't start until 3, and it's over at 4.6. It's 1,600 RPM or something. So the difference, if you know about that new GR Corolla coming out, that's claimed, I think, 228 kilowatts, but the same torque, but they've made the spread a little bit larger. So I think that one holds it all the way to, I think, 5,400 or something. You mentioned strapping it down. I ain't strapping anything down. He's strapping it down because I demand he gets his hands dirty. When you were sitting under that ugly ass of your WRX, I thought at least this one, it's not going to hit you in the head. You can get under the rear of the car a bit easier. So both these engines are direct injection, but this one has port injection as well, which is why when people modify them, they're able to upgrade the port injectors, which is a good thing. The port injection is really just there to wet the valves, and I think it's only used on idle.
Warm up, idle.
Warm up, yeah.
And then if it is in a lean condition, it will dump extra fuel.
Rocking our new 25-year-old merch, shop.fullboost.com.au. We don't have the right size boost tee to tap into the vacuum, so we're going to plot the ECU's boost graph through the OBD.
Yeah, we're just going to do a basic log of the car. Should give us all the standard parameters. We can have a look at fuel, ignition, throttle, and obviously boost. And we'll plot that in a nice graph and compare it to what we've seen with the Subaru.
What I'm going to attempt to do is Nintendo style, get the car in all-wheel drive test mode, because otherwise we can't do a run on the dyno. The Yaris is a bit complicated with everything. We have to do this handbrake on, clutch multiple times, pumps, and it has to get it. You have to give it this combination to put into all-wheel drive test mode, so it ignores. It's a bit more complicated than the old WRX that's 2002 technology over there.
Okay, engine off, handbrake on. Ignition on, handbrake off, engine off. Push the brake pedal and keep your foot on there. Ignition on, keep your foot on the brake pedal but the other foot off the clutch. Handbrake on, foot off the brake and then press the brake pedal 3 times. Pull the handbrake 3 times and hold it at the end. Push the brake pedal 3 times again and hold it at the end.
There we go.
Great success.
First go, it only took like a minute to do. If the engine gets turned off now, we have to do that every time. So I guess after a while you would remember the combination, but it is a bit, I've never seen a car like this do that. Have you ever seen that with car? Is it starting to be more common?
There's one with a Focus RS where you have to put it into gear several times and then it enables dyno mode.
That goes front wheel drive, doesn't it?
Correct, but it can pop out of that mode.
Oh.
It's really dangerous, so we tend to just take the ABS fuse out.
Yeah. Got out of it a bit early, didn't hit the limiter. Well, this is the boost plot. It's basically adjusting the boost, closing the throttle through the dyno run. So it looks like, they look like gear changes, that's just 4th gear. So this is power and torque for both cars overlaid. The obvious difference is the Yaris revs a lot harder. The Yaris is the green line, obviously. You can see how much it's basically got another whole 1,000 RPM on the power graph here.
My explanation would be the Yaris would be more like a hill, whereas the Subaru is more like a tabletop.
Yeah.
So it comes in, it's probably a lot lower down the spectrum than it should be based on how much boost it's making and the engine capacity, but it's designed in such a way to deliver consistent torque across the rev range, whereas the Yaris, it's relying heavily on the boost delivery, and that comes in through the mid-range, which is where you're driving most of the time, but then falls off, basically because it lacks the engine capacity and probably the turbo size. Yeah, the initial tuning for the GR Yaris, it kind of ghosts the stock curve. It's just more, right? You're running a higher baseline boost pressure and loading a little bit more ignition into it. Obviously, the main thing with the Yaris is it's trying to cap and control the boost through the rev range with the throttle. And that's something that we saw just on the stock file with yours on the dyno.
So there's been a lot of conjecture about this new WRX. It actually drives quite good down low. You can see the torque here. The torque band of this engine is basically the same. Look, at 2,400 all the way to basically almost its red line, it's the same torque graph. It's impressive actually. The Yaris is quite much lower here, peaks up through the mid-range and then it just falls over. We mentioned earlier the WRX, it's 1980s boost graph of 8 pounds, and what does it do? Peak just over 11.5 pounds or something. The Yaris is complete opposite. It ramps up pretty hard, 22.5 pounds, but holds it for a little bit through the mid-range. That's how the car drives, and it actually noses off quite a bit, falls away the boost. So at red line, we're about 7,000. It's only on 14.5 pounds. So it's quite a drop off. It's lost about 8 PSI up top. The gains of the Yaris to tune it would be to hold that boost all the way through the rev range. When the Yaris came out, it got criticised a lot by the internet, but now it seems to be fallen in favour, and people always compare the WRX to the Yaris now. Now the Yaris, as you know, it's a pretty highly strung engine from factory. There's less gains to be made with a much smaller motor. The WRX, which everyone's ripping on, this is clear that it's going to make good power. Like you get this even just 15 pounds holding that through the rev range, it's going to make a fair bit more power. It's going to have a lot more mid-range. So we've just run the two cars up on the dyno, very different cars. The Yaris makes less power, but on the road, seat of the pants, it feels quicker. It's definitely
over 200 kilos lighter.
It's 200 to 220 kilos lighter than the WRX. The other thing is, what we did mention earlier, it's slightly shorter gearing. So if we'd overlaid the road speed map, ignoring the RPM, you would see that the Yaris is also a little bit of course it's got shorter gearing and a little engine.
But it's got a taller first gear.
Yeah, it's a bit odd actually. Yeah. I don't mind the tall first gear.
But the Subaru, also seat of the pants, you don't get as much torque rush in a car that's not as lazy. Not that the Yaris is lazy, but it makes a little bit less torque down low. So when the torque, you're ramping in 22
pounds.
You've got 22 pounds where the Subaru is not even making 10. at that point.
Yeah, so it can you can kind of like stab the car and it will come on in a rush.
Yeah.
So of course it's one of those things, it may not be as quick as it feels, but who cares, it's a fun car to drive.
I'd be keen to see putting some sort of, tune-up in both cars. I'd like to do a flex fuel tune in the Subaru if possible, but
I think the Subaru, just the fact it's got a much bigger...
much bigger engine.
Much bigger engine, it's on no boost. That has got, I think, massive room for improvement. And yes, it's a heavier car, but you're going to make, say, up to 200 kilowatts with this. I think that thing will make 250 easy.
I don't know about easy. We'll see. Anyway, we're probably going to have to wait for some tuning software to come out. But it's about time we tune your car.
Yeah, I know. And you may be wondering, yes, I had wheels on this. I took them off, and I'm that lazy, they haven't been on the car for 6 months.
This year marks the 25th year that we have been behind the cameras, and to celebrate we have a fresh new merch design. Grab your track gear from shop.fullboost.com.au.
Handbrake on, I'll verbalise this. It's ignition off, handbrake on. You start the engine.
Ignition off.
You
I've already forgotten.
I think that is just vomit material from the boost level, isn't it?